campaign trail, and how reparations is a conversation, particularly to Georgians, because I had an opportunity to travel around the state and talk about this, particularly to Georgians. They don't get it, Dr. Darity.
Hmm.
They don't get it. They don't believe it. They don't understand it. I had one gentleman pull me to the side, Dr. Darity, and he said, and it was he and I, and he asked me, he said, Tamara, what is reparations? I've never heard the word before.
Well, I don't think he's unusual on that score, actually. I think that there's a widespread lack of information about what reparations means and what it stands for. And I don't know if this would be helpful, but I guess we could start with basics this evening if you'd like.
Yes, sir. The basics, because there's so few people. Like I said, it was hard for me as a candidate, because as a candidate, I'm running, I'm trying to spread the word about my candidacy holistically. But when I started to talk about reparations, that's where people were like, what is it? How does, who's going to get it? Just questions after questions after questions, Dr. Darity.
So the starting point from my perspective is thinking about the entire history of how white supremacy has operated in the United States and what its impact has been on the lives of Black people who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. I think that a lot of people have heard of the idea of 40 acres and a mule, but they really don't know the story. And I think they frequently think it's something that is kind of the equivalent of an urban myth. Uh, but in fact, 40 acres and a mule represents a promise that was made to folks who had been enslaved in the United States at the point of emancipation. And this was a promise that took the form of a commitment on the part of the federal government to provide them with an initial stake uh, in property in the United States as they came out of the years of bondage. That stake initially was in the form of a directive that was made by General Sherman uh, while the war was still taking place. This was a directive in January 1865 that designated a territory stretching from the Sea Islands of South Carolina to northern Georgia as a territory that was to be assigned to the formerly enslaved. Approximately 5.3 million acres of land. This land was supposed to be designated for the formerly enslaved, and it was supposed to be the beginning of a process that would have resulted in 40 million acres of land being assigned to the freedmen. But instead, out of that 5.3 million acres that Sherman designated, only 400,000 acres were distributed to the formerly enslaved, 40,000 of the formerly enslaved, out of 4 million newly emancipated individuals. And even that allotment was taken back by the federal government and restored to the slaveholders under the order of Andrew Johnson, the president who succeeded Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. And in fact, Andrew Johnson played a central role in undermining every single effort that was made to ensure that the newly emancipated received full citizenship rights in the United States. So that's the beginning of what we now view as the modern racial wealth gap. It's the denial of the ancestors of today's living descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. It's the denial of that initial 40-acre land grant. And it occurs at the same time that about 1.5 million white families were receiving 160-acre land grants under the terms of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was initiated in 1862, and it was a wealth building mechanism, but it was restricted for the most part to white Americans, to the point that today it's estimated that about 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of the Homestead Acts. And so that's the beginning of the racial wealth gap today, because the failure to provide the 40 acres to the formerly enslaved and the provision of 160 acres to many, many white families set up a period of intergenerational transmission of disadvantage for blacks and advantage for whites, arising out of public policy, a policy that was designed to deprive blacks of the capacity to accumulate wealth and to provide whites with the capacity to do the same thing. So today, we have a situation in which the average black household has $850,000 less in net worth than the average white household. This corresponds to a situation in which Black American descendants of U.S. slavery are about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And so, what Kirsten Mullen and I argue in the pages of From Here to Equality is that one of the primary objectives of a reparations plan is to correct that disparity, to put Black Americans in a situation where their share of the nation's wealth is at least equal to their share of the nation's population. And if we were to do that, it would require an expenditure of at least 10 to 12 trillion dollars to correct the imbalance. So that's what reparations is about. It's about correcting the effects of this historic injustice that initially is locked into place by the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants. And things just get aggravated subsequently. In the aftermath of the Civil War, we have nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States that carries with it its own set of deprivations. And that period was accompanied by a series of white massacres that took place north and south, east and west, virtually 100 of them that took place between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s. And these massacres resulted in severe loss of Black lives, but also in many instances, either the destruction or the appropriation of Black-owned property by the white terrorists, white mobsters. And then following that, in the aftermath of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, we have ongoing mass incarceration. We have a continuation of police executions of unarmed Blacks, modern form of lynching, essentially. And we have discrimination that continues in housing, credit, and employment. So there's a single community in the United States that has been subjected to all three phases, from slavery to the present moment, all three phases of atrocities. And that's reflected in the difference in wealth between Blacks and whites, which we take as the best cumulative indicator of the intergenerational effects of white supremacy. So Black lives are undervalued and Black lives are subjected to deprivation. And what we really do need to try to correct those circumstances to the extent possible is a program of reparations.
Let me ask you, Dr. Darity, this particular group of Black people, Black is such an encompassing word, African American, Black, people of color. Can you kind of be very specific and kind of point us to who are these people that are owed reparations? Because it's not all Black people in America.
No, it's not all Black people in the United States who merit reparations under the terms of the type of plan that I've been describing. It's those Blacks in the United States whose existing position with respect to wealth has been shaped by the cumulative effects of slavery, the Jim Crow period, and ongoing atrocities. And these are individuals who are the living descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, the living descendants of the uh, of the freedmen and freedwomen who were denied the 40-acre land grants in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. That's who merits reparations, because that's the community that has a very unique and specific claim on the United States government.
HR 40, Dr. Darity, and Cory Booker's bill in the U.S. Congress right now, it needs work. This bill speaks specifically to just a study, but you have some specific edits that you feel need to happen to on the heels of the eve of the first what is it, a committee meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.
Actually, it's a hearing tomorrow, and it would be the second hearing that's been held on HR 40. The first one was held on June 19th, 2019, or Juneteenth. And actually, I was invited to provide testimony at that hearing, and I wasn't able to attend in person, so I submitted written testimony. And that written testimony is in the record for all who would like to review it. It's also available online through the Crisis magazine under the title of under an article of the title "The Case for Reparations." Um, but I think what was unique about the Juneteenth hearing, from my perspective, is the fact that virtually none of the folks who provided testimony actually talked about HR 40. Virtually everyone, and I think I was the sole exception in my written testimony, virtually everyone talked about whether or not they were against or whether they were for reparations. But they didn't really talk about the content of the text of HR 40. I sometimes wonder if that was an evasion that was intentional, uh, because the text has so many flaws that need to be addressed. In fact, one might conclude that the flaws are so severe that you need to replace the legislation with something different. Um, I'm not primarily concerned about the fact that this is a bill for a commission rather than a reparations program, because I think there is a potential value to having a commission as a prelude to having a reparations plan. But I am concerned that the commission that would be produced by HR 40 would not lead us to true reparations. And so I've argued that it would be important and vital to actually provide the commission with specific instructions about what must be contained in any legislative proposals that they bring forward to Congress. And I've highlighted three elements. The first is that the legislation should make it specific that the recipients of reparations must be Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. That's the first condition that should be built into any proposals that the commission generates. The second is that the commission should ensure that the proposals that it brings forward are designed in such a way that the racial wealth gap in the United States would be eliminated through the reparations plan. And then the third and final characteristic that I think is essential is that the legislation needs to indicate that that direct payments would be made to the eligible recipients, in the same way in which other types of reparations plans have involved direct payments to eligible recipients, whether it's the German reparations payments to victims of the Holocaust, or in the U.S. context, it's the United States government's payment of reparations to the Japanese American community that was subjected to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. So it should be done in the same way for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And I'm somewhat open-minded about whether it's a matter of cash transfers or other types of ways in which the funds are directed towards the people who merit them could be trust accounts, it could be some form of endowment, or some combination thereof. But the individual recipients ultimately are the folks who should have discretion over the use of the funds, and so the funds should go directly to them.
And you know, Dr. Darity, that question that I got is the end. I felt insulted when they're like talking about how we spend money as a people and we would waste it, or we need financial literacy. Can you speak to that, Dr. Darity?
Well, actually, in comparison with the rest of Americans, Black Americans are actually relatively frugal. I think that the best evidence that we have now are some estimates that indicate that white households spend 1.3 times as much as Black households out of a given level of income. Now, how's that possible? Well, it's possible because the white households have considerably higher levels of wealth. Uh, Even if we think about the very concentrated degree of wealth ownership or wealth holdings in the United States, uh, there are huge disparities at the upper end of the wealth distribution, where approximately 25% of white households have a net worth in excess of $1 million, and it's only 4% of Black households. And so, even though wealth is generally unevenly distributed, there's huge differences in the proportionate amount that's distributed across Black America versus the proportionate amount that is distributed across white America. The Black amount is starkly lower. I mean, even if we go to the low end of the distribution, white households in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, so the poorest white households, have about $15,000 in net worth. Uh, the poorest Black households have a net worth that is close to zero. So there's disparities all along the income distribution in terms of wealth holdings. And these disparities are so significant that they really do have dramatic effects on people's life chances, life outcomes, opportunities, options, and capacity to fulfill their dreams and aspirations. And so this is the critical dimension that needs to be addressed by a reparations plan.
Dr. Darity, can you speak to land? You know, the black farmers and the farmland that we once had. Can you speak to that? Where are we now as a people?
So, as I said originally, the intent or the promise was to provide the formerly enslaved with at least 40 million acres of land, and that promise was never fulfilled. Uh, I think in the aftermath of the Civil War, somehow, almost uh, through dint of near mystical effort, Black Americans managed to accumulate about 15 million acres of land by the early part of the 20th century. And then that land was progressively lost. And it was progressively lost not just by the land disappearing, but in large measure by white Americans finding a variety of ways to appropriate or seize the land and make it their own property. So that when we get into the latter half of the 20th century, we have a situation where the 15 million acres of land had diminished to about 1 million acres. And in the process, it meant that individuals who were engaged in farming, there are non-residential purposes of land. There are also purposes that land can be put to that don't involve farming. But those Black Americans who were engaged in farming also experienced a progressive loss in land and in their capacity to maintain themselves in that business. So we have a long history of land deprivation, even among the amounts of land that we manage uh, to gain at our own behest. And so so that has had strong disadvantages for Black folks who are engaged in farming. But I think that the answer to the consequences of that is not to have the federal government do another land allocation, not at this point. What the federal government should do is provide folks with the monetary resources that would allow those who want to purchase land or extend land holdings to do so, and those who would prefer to do something else in terms of the way in which they accumulate wealth to do that. So I think it should be a matter of discretion rather than the federal government setting up a new land reform. I think that's unrealistic and probably not satisfactory in the beginnings of the 21st century.
Yeah, because I understand that you kind of see it as a bit problematic. So you kind of follow the mantra of Dr. King, cut the check. You want to cut the check, just pay.
Yeah,
Then we can
yeah,
people.
yeah. You know, people say things like reparations is more than a check. Well, the check is not trivial. I mean, if we're talking about increasing the average household wealth among Black Americans by $850,000, which would correspond roughly to an additional $260,000 to $300,000 per person, uh, cutting the check is quite significant and important. And I mean, it would really be transformative in people's lives. So. I don't really need to make the claim that it has to be more than cutting a check, because cutting a check is not a trivial act in this context.
Yeah, I think about, there's so many people that don't believe. And like I said, my journey on the campaign trail, I ran into that over and over again, where they didn't know what it was. And then when I explained it and I'm excited about it, then there's a lot of people that still don't believe that this will ever happen. And I'm like, may not be for me, it may not be for my children, but it may be for my children's children. So I do believe that one day it will happen. I may not live to see it, but I do believe that one day it absolutely will happen. I believe that in this COVID season, there's a reckoning that's happening in this country, and I believe it is going to happen. And I think, when you think about from, us being freed from slavery, and then, getting the right to vote, there was almost 100 years right there, right? So whatever place and space that I'm in and I'm doing this work, I am committed to doing it. And Dr. Darity, obviously for the last 30 plus years, you've been committed to doing the work too.
Yeah, let me just say that, prior to the period where I made the commitment to do serious work on this research and advocacy, I was a reparations skeptic also, like many of the people that you're encountering today. I didn't think it was something that was realistic, even if I did feel that it was morally correct. I just didn't think it would ever happen. But I had my road to Damascus moment where I ended up saying to myself, even if the odds are extremely long for this to occur, it is so much the right thing to do that we might as well build a plan for it, and perhaps the opportunity will arise eventually for that plan to be taken seriously and become something that is a political reality. And so I've been somewhat surprised at the climate around discussions for reparations that has existed since 2019, when we finally had credible political candidates actually talking about reparations. Even if they didn't endorse it, at least they uttered the term. And I know that you built your campaign around it. And as far as I know, you're not the only person to do that. So, I think we're in a very different climate in terms of thinking about reparations. And I think, I've said a number of times, if it was 1819 in the United States, I may think that slavery would never come to an end. but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't have tried to find the courage to fight against or resist slavery in 1819. And so similarly today, even if we might think that the odds are still long for reparations to be adopted, that's not a reason to not engage in the process of trying to struggle to make it happen. So that's where I stand. There's a debt that hasn't been paid for 156 years. It may not be paid in my lifetime, but I'm certainly going to try to do my best to see if I can help make it happen.
Yeah, I'm in. I'm in. I can't imagine me. This is so, I feel like I'm in my purpose. You know, I feel like I'm living in my purpose every time I talk about it. And like I said, I believe it with all my heart and all my soul. I absolutely believe that one day it is going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on in the chat. I won't have time to read it, y'all, because this is only scheduled to be a 30-minute broadcast. I have about another 2 minutes with Dr. Sandy Darity, and I want to give him the final words because, you know, I knew people, they need to know who you are. This has been your life's work, Dr. Darity. And I just appreciate all that, you know, all that you've given this and, you know, seeing something in candidates like me and people that are coming along, you know, just, I appreciate you sincerely, sir.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Not everybody appreciates me, so
yes, we do. Over here, we do.
But yeah, I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for you and others who are making the commitment through the political system to try to make this happen. I think it's a really exciting moment, and you know, I'm an old head, and so it's very gratifying to me to see some of the folks who are considerably younger than I am taking up the torch, taking up the mantle, because you know, eventually some of us will see the day happen when restitution is finally made.
I want to thank you for joining me on this broadcast tonight. This is everything I needed it to be and wanted to be and expected it to be. So I'm excited and I'm going to continue to fight. I'm going to continue to talk about reparations. And I don't know, I'm praying and trusting God that if I'm supposed to run again, that he'll make that path plain and clear. So I'm where I need to be, and I will continue to fight for reparations, Dr. Darity. I absolutely will.
All right, I'm in there with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I am Tamara Johnson-Shealy, and I will see you tomorrow night right here on YouTube with Teaching with Tamara, where we are keeping up with Congress, y'all. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.